We play and call it work.
Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and today I want to talk about terrain in Warhammer 40k 9th edition. Terrain has always been a very important part of almost any miniature wargame, and 40k is no exception. It is my favorite part of the hobby. To me, the miniatures are wonderful, but if you don't have the great backdrop of awesome terrain, then it really takes away from something about the game. Well, thankfully, in 9th edition, Games Workshop has finally decided to write terrain rules that are usable on the playing field, that don't just say, well, we'll ignore it mainly except for blocking line of sight and hampering movement. So in this video here, we're going to take a look at those new terrain rules and how they apply to you and your battles. Let's take a look. Terrain categories. Every single piece of terrain in your tabletop will now have one of four categories. 1. Hills. Hills come in all sorts of varieties of shapes and sizes. Whether they are freestanding or modeled into the battlefield itself, they're just meant to give raised areas for troops to have better line of sight. In 9th edition, hills basically have very little effect on your game and are not treated as having any special rules. They can't be targeted, they don't provide cover, or anything else. You do still use true line of sight, so if a hill blocks line of sight, then they will continue to do that. But other than that, they don't provide any real rules. Now, there's one exception to that, which I think most people will be making. If you have more complex hills, like the one in the back, you may want to give it its own custom terrain features because it actually does act more like an obstacle or area terrain. But we'll talk about that later in the video. Number 2, obstacles. Obstacles include things like barricades, ruined walls, statuary, pipes, battlefield debris. All of these things are in the obstacles area rather than area terrain. Now your models can move up and over, down, whatever you want to do, following the normal rules for movement. The only models that can get cover from this are infantry, beasts, and swarms. Now an infantry, beast, or swarm model receives the benefits of cover from an obstacle while it's within 3 inches, it used to be 1 inch in 8th edition, of the obstacle, and the firing model or firing unit cannot draw one line to every part of their base. For example, this squad of Necrons is firing at these Space Marines, and right now all the Space Marines are within 3 inches, not wholly within, but within 3 inches, and there's no way for them to draw a line 1 millimeter thick that does not pass over the barricade that can see every part of the base. So if we were to move this one out here and maintain our coherency, then remember it's model by model whether they have cover. It is not the unit that has cover, it is the model. And so when I fire this way, you can see that this model is out in the open. Even though he's still within 3 inches of the barricade, he would not have cover from the firing Necrons. Now remember, however, that it's the defender who gets to choose where wounds are allocated. So you can always just choose to put it on models that do have the benefits of the cover. So it is not the unit that has cover, it is the model that you look at for cover. And if there's more than one firing model, you can just choose any one of them to try to draw it. And it would be obviously the attacker that would choose the model, say, hey, he's out in the open, so he won't have cover. But then the defender can just put the wounds on them to get whatever bonuses that come from that. In this case, getting +1 to their saves. It's important to note again that it's only infantry, beasts, or swarms. So it does not include vehicles, monsters, or bikes. You're going to find that those 3 typically cannot have any way to get a bonus to their saves because of cover. Number 3, area terrain. Area terrain includes things like ruins, or woods, or craters, or any terrain features that typically have some sort of footprint. Now, it's not always perfectly identifiable what that footprint is. In the case of the 3 pieces of terrain you see here, it is pretty easy. This crater's footprint is just anything that's gray. The woods are this perfect outline from the Citadel Woods, and the ruin happens to have a base. But not all ruins have bases, and not everything will have a base that is set upon or a perfectly defined lower ground. So the best thing that you can do is before the game begins, as you set up terrain, is you and your opponent agree to what that area is defined as. Usually pretty obvious, but sometimes needs to have some discussions. Infantry, beasts, and swarm models receive the benefits of cover from area terrain features while they are within it, not wholly within it. So in the case of these Necrons, all 5 models would have the benefits of cover, whatever the crater would happen to give them. Whereas these Space Marines only the 3 that are on or in the area terrain would have it, while the 2 out front would not. It's important to note that while area terrain does not by itself block line of sight, you will find that there are terrain traits that we will be applying to them that either give penalties for shooting through them or do block line of sight beyond them. But that is specific to certain terrain traits, which we'll cover very soon. Number 4, buildings. Buildings are typically units with a fortification battlefield role and the building keyword. So we're not talking about solid buildings as opposed to ruins. Solid buildings we'll have to treat in our custom area, which we'll talk about later in the video. So these are typically brought and paid for by one of the players in their army. They're treated as a unit in that army and will have their own rules on their data sheets on exactly how to use them in the game. Terrain traits. The terrain category is only the first step in defining the rules for terrain. So we have our 4 categories, which we already talked about: hills, obstacles, area terrain, and buildings. Now we're going to talk about terrain traits. Every piece of terrain on the board is typically assigned traits. You and your opponent must agree before the game what traits are assigned. The rulebook does give us some common traits, which we'll take a look at as well. So that'll solve probably 80 to 90% of your cases, after which you may have to make up some and have custom terrain traits, which we'll also cover in this video. But first, let's go through all the different traits that can be applied to your terrain and how they work. Number 1, defensible. Terrain such as these ruins, this woods, or this barricade or pipe have the defensible trait. Infantry gain benefits from defensible. If they're all on a piece of area terrain, or if they're all within 3 inches of an obstacle, then they can either, when declared as a charge target, set to defend or hold steady. If they hold steady, then if they spend a command point to overwatch, they overwatch on 5 or 6 rather than just 6. If they set to defend, they can't fire overwatch, but they get to add 1 to hit rolls in the next fight phase. With obstacles, it can sometimes be hard to determine whether or not they can use a defensible trait to hold steady or set to defend. What you need to do is when the charge target is declared, so for example, these Necrons are charged into Space Marines, you draw a line 1 millimeter thick between the 2 nearest models, which would be these 2 models back here. And if that passes over the obstacle, and the unit is all within 3 inches of the obstacle, then they could choose to hold steady or set to defend. Now you might look at this and think, well, no, this Space Marine over here, he's out in the open. And that would only matter if they were firing at them and you allocated wounds to him. But for charging, it does work slightly differently. Number 2, defense line. The defense line terrain trait is usually applied to obstacles such as barricades, fuel pipes, or even ruined walls. The rules for defense line allow you to charge a unit behind it even if you cannot get in the typical engagement range of 1 inch horizontally and 5 inches vertically. For example, if these Necrons wanted to charge the Space Marines, but I only rolled, let's say, a 3-inch charge, well, 3 inches would actually get this model to touch this terrain feature. And you can actually charge an enemy unit that is within, the unit is within 1 inch of the terrain feature, as long as your model touches the terrain feature and is within 2 inches of the enemy. So this model will be in range. Also, the models who are eligible to fight are those who are touching the terrain feature and fighting a model on the opposite side of the terrain feature who is within 2 inches. So right now, only 2 of these Necrons could fight. The rest of them, even though they're within half an inch of a model who's able to fight, would not be able to fight. And the Space Marines would not be able to fight back unless they piled in and also touched the terrain feature. And now they're within 2 inches and touching. So now these models are all eligible to fight. Now, as of the making of this video, it is not clear whether or not those units count as being in engagement range, because it's actually quite possible for them not to be an inch apart from each other, but still able to fight each other. So do they count as being in engagement range? I think the intent is yes, but the rules do not specify that. So theoretically, with the rules as written, this Space Marine unit could walk away without any penalties, without having to fall back in their subsequent turn. I think it's meant to be an engagement range, and I wouldn't be surprised if an FAQ came out and did clarify that. Number 3, breachable. Some terrain such as ruins, woods, or ruined walls will have the breachable trait, which allows infantry, beasts, and swarm units to move through them and just ignore any of their parts, whether or not they can fit or not. So these models could just pass through the wall. They don't have to worry about going around wherever the doors are or the windows. can even pass through things like this tree trunk and not have to measure around it, or passing through the walls of a ruin. It's only infantry, beasts, and swarms, not bikes, vehicles, or monsters. Number 4, difficult ground. Terrain such as these woods, this barricade or fuel pipe, and the crater have the difficult ground terrain trait, which is quite simple. When a unit moves, or advances, falls back, or charges over this terrain feature, if any one of the models in the unit are going to pass over that in any way, even if the terrain feature is less than an inch tall, then you must subtract 2 from the total movement that the unit can do. So if they roll a 10-inch charge on dice and they want to pass over it, it becomes an 8-inch charge for every single model in that unit. Number 5, dense cover. Dense cover, such as you see these woods or ruined walls, will force you to subtract 1 from hit rolls when resolving attacks with ranged weapons, unless you can draw straight lines 1 millimeter in thickness to every part of at least one model's base or hull from a single point on the attacking model's base or hull without any of those lines passing over or through any part of that terrain feature with that trait. Now there are some nuances here that are very important. If I move this model out here and put them in coherency, now every one of these Necrons is able to see that without passing over to get to his base. So they will not suffer a -1 to hit. However, if I were to place this Space Marine more right here and spread out the Necrons a bit more, then you might find that some of the models can see it without passing over the obstacle, but other ones cannot. In that case, you actually do it model by model. The ones that can see that model out in the open do not suffer the -1 hit penalty, and the rest of them do. 40k and Age of Sigmar are written assuming that you're going to do your attacks one at a time, and that you just roll them together to speed the game up. But a lot of rules resolutions can come about when you just look at it as if you were rolling one attack at a time. Furthermore, this penalty is ignored if the firing unit is also within 3 inches of an obstacle that has this trait. They also ignore it if they're on the same piece of area terrain that would be imposing the -1 penalty for their ranged attacks. The last exception is if you are firing at an aircraft or a model with a wounds characteristic of 18 or more, you don't suffer the penalty. The aircraft or that large model will suffer the penalty if they're firing at a unit that has this rule imposed. Number 6, unstable position. You cannot set up models on top of a piece of terrain that has the unstable position rule, such as this fuel pipe or these ruined walls. So no longer do you have to worry about finagling your models. Can you get them to stand, or put them on top of these little areas right here and hope that they will stay. Number 7, exposed position. Terrain such as these armored containers with the exposed position trait do not grant the benefits of cover when you are on top of them. You only get it if you are not on top of them within 3 inches and following all the other rules. Number 8, obscuring. Some terrain features like this ruin have the obscuring terrain feature. If they're at least 5 inches in height, they can have this. Models cannot see through or over this terrain feature. So right now, these Necrons and Space Marines cannot see each other. Even though if I did stoop down, there's plenty of walls and windows and doors to see through. This allows you to have more line of sight blocking terrain on the table. Once again, we ignore aircraft and models with the wounds characteristic of 18 or more. It's also important to note that the moment any of the models are on this terrain feature, they are not obscured. Number 9, light cover. These ruins, these craters, this fuel pipe, all have the light cover terrain trait. If a model is benefiting from cover from any of these and is attacked with a ranged weapon, then they get to add 1 to their saving throws. Not invulnerable saves, of course. Remember, only infantry, beasts, and swarms can benefit from cover from these terrain features. So bikes, vehicles, and monsters, no dice. Number 10, heavy cover. Heavy cover works just like light cover, giving you +1 to your saving throws, except this is against melee attacks, not ranged attacks, if you are receiving the benefits of that cover. This does not count if your unit made the charge. So if these Space Marines charge the Necrons would get the benefit of the cover. They get +1 of their saving throws against their melee attacks, but the Space Marines wouldn't. In subsequent turns, both sides would have that advantage. Number 11, scalable. Only infantry, beasts, and swarm models, and models that can fly, can be set up or end a move on top of an obstacle terrain feature with this trait. If it's area terrain, such as the ruins, then you can still be on the bottom level, but if you want to go to the upper levels, you must once again be infantry, beasts, swarms, or a model that can fly. Number 12, Inspiring. Units wholly within 6 inches of a terrain feature with the inspiring terrain trait will get +1 to their leadership if the keyword that the inspiring has matches their faction. For example, this statue right here has inspiring and in brackets Imperium. So the Space Marines would benefit from this because they have the Imperium keyword, but the Necrons wouldn't. If it had the inspiring Necron keyword, then it would inspire the Necrons, giving them +1 leadership, and not the Space Marines. Common terrain features. How are we doing? Are we confused yet? I've thrown a lot of words at you with a lot of rules. I remember the first time I read through it, it seemed like there was a lot to remember. But once you started playing the game and applying these to the terrain features on the table, they made a lot of sense. You realized, oh yeah, all the barricades are defense lines. The ruins are scalable and breachable. I can just pass through them and move models up them. These things are dense cover. These are light cover. This is heavy cover. And they became a lot easier to remember, a lot like the other rules in the book. Thankfully, Games Workshop has a couple pages in the book that show you a lot of common terrain features and what traits and categories they belong to. Let's look at a few of them right now so you can see how they work. And I think once you see practically how they interact with the models, a lot of it will click inside of your head. For example, these armor containers are considered to be obstacles. They have the light cover, scalable, and exposed position special traits. What does that mean? Well, light cover means that if you're benefiting from cover, you get +1 to your saves. So right now, these 5 Necrons would be considered benefiting from cover because they're within 3 inches and a line would pass over that obstacle. However, they have the exposed position trait, which says if you're on top of it, you don't get cover. So now we know it's just a 3 in the back that would have cover from any range attacks from these Space Marines. Lastly, it's scalable, which means yes, I can place models on top of this if they are infantry, beasts, or swarms, but not monsters, vehicles, or bikes, unless they have the fly keyword. Craters are pretty easy. They are the category area terrain, so you have to have a model touching or on it to benefit from it. And these ones have light cover and difficult ground. That's all. The light cover giving +1 to the saves against ranged weapons. So these Necron warriors, since they're all within the terrain, every single model would benefit from that, regardless of the direction that they're being shot at. And difficult ground says that if those Necrons want to move, do a normal move, advance, or charge or fall back, they would subtract 2 from their movement. And if these Space Marines want to charge, because they're going to have to pass over that terrain feature, they will also lose 2 inches from their charge. This fuel pipe is an obstacle, and it has the following terrain traits: defense line, light cover, heavy cover, defensible, unstable position, and difficult ground. Now that sounds like a lot of different things, but once you start seeing how they interact, it makes sense. Defense line states that if these Space Marines want to charge the Necrons, then all they have to do is touch it because they're within 2 inches of the Necron warriors. Light cover and heavy cover states that those Necrons will have +1 to their saves against shooting for light cover and against the melee attacks that come across the obstacles in close combat. Defensible means that if they are declared as a charge target, they can either opt to get 5-up Overwatch or +1 to their hit rolls in the next fight phase. Overwatch, once again, you still have to spend a command point to fire the Overwatch. Unstable position means that you cannot place models on top of it, and thank goodness, because that's really hard. And difficult ground is that if you want to pass over it, you'll lose 2 inches of movement. Once you put those together, you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. It'll slow me down to move over it. I can charge the obstacle instead of the models. I get cover from it, etc. These ruined walls are obstacles. They have the traits defense line, breachable, dense cover, defensible, and unstable position. Once again, a lot of those are just one word to describe one little rule. So defense line, again, you can charge and just touch it as long as there is a model within 2 inches on the other side in order to make a charge. Because they're far enough back, I could actually make it through, so that would not matter. Breachable means that infantry, swarms, and beasts can just pass through it. Don't worry about going around the walls, or you can just ignore all the different parts of the model itself, as long as you end on the other side of it. Dense cover means if I'm firing through it, even to a unit that's within 3 inches of it, then I get -1 to my hit rolls. Defensible means that when declared as a charge target, the Necrons could choose once again to have their Overwatch hit on 5s, or to get +1 to their hit rolls in the fight phase. An unstable position just once again means you can't place a model on top of it because you're not allowed. A very common sight on any Warhammer 40k board are ruins. This is different than ruined walls. I think with the example I showed here, you can see the stark contrast. A ruin is a much larger building, whereas ruined walls are just the odd wall here or there. A ruin is categorized as area terrain. It is scalable, breachable, light cover, defensible, and obscuring. So scalable means that infantry, beasts, and swarms and models with fly can go up to the upper levels. Breachable means that infantry, beast, and swarm can just pass through the walls, not worrying about finding windows or openings. Light cover means that if you are benefiting from cover, in other words, these Necron warriors would be, but not the Space Marines, then you would get +1 to your saves against ranged attacks. Defensible is, once again, if they're declared as a charged target, they can overwatch in 5+ or get +1 to hit in the following fight phase. And obscuring is that models cannot see through or over this terrain, but they can see into it. So I can see these Necrons, but if they're on the other side of the building, then we could not see each other. There are a couple more examples in the book, but I think you're starting to get the point where it has all these rules applied to it, but it's really just to define what can go on top of it, what counts as getting cover behind it, what kind of cover do you get? Do you get a -1 to hit when you shoot through it? All these traits allow you to really look at a piece of terrain and know exactly how it's supposed to interact with the units on the table. Whether or not you think a ruin should be area terrain or an obstacle, or whether you think that it's garbage that they can't see through it, even though I clearly can see that model on the other side, it gives you a definition that is easy to withhold or to uphold. That when you put it there, you're like, you look through it, I know I can see that unit, but I know the rules say that I cannot, so therefore I cannot. It allows your terrain to have a lot more use as well. All of a sudden, when you put those ruins down, and you're frustrated that your opponent can still just form up a gun line and shoot wherever the heck he wants because he can just look through all those cracks and see you, well, now it blocks line of sight, which gives a little bit more benefit to some strategy and also maybe to close combat armies as well. However, you're going to have some custom terrain that maybe doesn't fit nicely into any of these categories. Is a solid building treated the same as a ruin? Or are these solid pieces of rocks really hills? Let's take a look at a couple of those and what we've decided to apply to those. Now remember, this is what we at MiniWarGaming have decided to do. This is definitely not the rule. The rule is that you and your opponent agree to what the terrain is. So whether you do it like us or in another way, remember, it's up to you guys to agree on what you do. So the way that we do it is correct, and the way that you do it is also correct. Not just because we're trying to be friendly, but because that is actually the rule, that as long as you agree, then that is correct. So let's take a look. The biggest discussion we had was talking about solid buildings such as these ones. They don't have the building category because those are fortifications or buildings that you've purchased and add to your army. But are they area terrain or are they obstacles? We had a big discussion on this and ended up deciding that they're obstacles. The reason for this is area terrain only gives you the benefit of cover if you are totally on it or within it. Whereas obstacles also give you the benefit if you are partly covered by it. So this Space Marine would be partly covered and get the benefits of cover. And we wanted both of those to be the case. Obstacles work even when you're on top and you can fully see the base because you're still passing the line over the obstacle. And so that does keep the benefits of cover there. We gave them the following rules. We gave them defensible, so the +1 to fight, or you can overwatch in 5+. We did not give them breachable, so you can't pass through them, although I could see arguments where, yeah, you totally could. They would just find doors or windows or however they want to do it, but we did not give them breachable. We also gave them light cover, so you get +1 to your saves if you're shot at, and finally, scalable. So that's it. Defensible, light cover, and scalable was all we had to do, and call them obstacles, and that covered majority of what we wanted to do. Is it perfect? No, but it gives them rules that we can actually use in the game that we never really got to do in 8th edition. Another one that was difficult were a rocky terrain that we have here. The problem is some of the custom terrain that you make is really more like multiple pieces of terrain stacked together. And so if you try to then break it down, it can be quite difficult. So these ones we ended up just calling obstacles, because you might think, well, this might be a hill, whereas this is an obstacle, but it's really hard to differentiate them. So we just call them obstacles, light cover, and exposed positions, and scalable. And so that means the exposed positions that when you're up here, you don't get the benefits of cover. But we still decided that if you're firing from this direction and this part is covering you, then you would. So it's not enough just to be on it. You have to actually be blocked by it as well. And scalable, of course, infantry, beasts, and swarms can go up there, as well as models with fly. And that's it. We didn't want to give it more rules than that, because then it gets really complicated. So that kept it simple. Sometimes you might just say, hey, they're obstacles and we're not going to give them any rules, which just means obstacles will allow you to block line of sight a little bit, just depending on where they are set. Heck, if you're going to do that, you can even not even say they're obstacles and just put them on the table and treat them as nothing, and they just block line of sight wherever they happen to be. According to the rules, hills should not have anything happening except maybe being able to block line of sight naturally. But for hills like this one, that seems like that's not the case. Surely you can get some cover by being blocked by it. So we turn these hills into obstacles instead, but really only if you're being blocked by the flat edges. So if you're just on this area right here, it is just a hill. So once again, this is almost like a multi-piece of terrain, that the base of it is a hill, so your vehicles and monsters could still go on it, but the chunks and the wall would be treated as an obstacle, providing light cover. And that one is really just that, obstacle light cover, but the flat part is still considered a hill. The last example I'll give today is this aquarium tree. So we bought this from an aquarium store and then repainted it. These ones were a little tougher because they're just big trees, but you can't really apply the tree rules to them or the woods rules because they don't follow the same pattern or look. So what we decided to do is make them obstacles and obscuring, which means you cannot actually see through them or over them. This allowed you to create a table of these that had all sorts of line of sight blocking areas, which is really interesting. Because it's obscuring, you don't also have to apply the light cover rule because you can't see the models that are passing through it. And if you could, then it was a rare occasion. So just obstacle, obscuring was enough. So this video ended up being a lot longer than I had intended. I wanted it to be 10 or 15 minutes, quickly going through all the rules. But as I explained them, I realized there's a lot of rules here with the categories and the terrain traits, and then figuring out how you're going to use them on your table. In the end, though, I think this is a huge benefit to 9th edition. Do you agree? Let me know in the comments below. And what parts do you like? How would you define the terrain features that I put on the table? You can even disagree with the ones that Games Workshop defines and says, no, that's definitely area terrain, or no, that's definitely an obstacle. Would you change them? I'd love to hear your comments below. And of course, stay tuned for more 9th edition coverage and check out a battle report, because we're gonna have battle reports all throughout 9th edition. Tons of stuff is already up. If you are a Vault member, you get even more battle reports. Stay tuned for more narrative campaigns, more explanation videos, more discussion as 9th edition continues. And it'll be coming out very soon if this video is posted when I think it's going to come out. Thanks so much for watching. Happy wargaming.
Thank you so much for watching, and remember, Luke and I are playing another game in the vault, 1,500 points of Necrons versus Raven Guard, full drop pod, new point values, first FAQ, first game with all that. Now that isn't a MiniWarGaming vault right now. If not already a vault member, click the link below, get to a 7-day free trial. Thanks for watching, everybody. Happy wargaming.